So today we have Vera Demberg with us, and Vera is an intern here, just finishing up her internship. Normally, she's at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, where in the Department of Informatics, where she's studying a combination of computer science, psycholinguistics, computational linguistics, and she's going to tell us about models of how people understand sentences, sentence structure, and I guess how computers can take advantage of that. So take it away. Oh, and I wanted to say that afterwards we'll be going to lunch. Anyone who wants to ask more questions can join us, and Vera's here for another week if anybody has interest in discussing this further. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for the introduction. So I'm going to talk about my Ph.D. about modeling human sentence processing. Right. So, and why would one want to study that at all? So on the one hand side, there's the theoretical interest of how does the brain process language. And here, cognitive modeling can help us to understand better in terms, if we model what's going on in the brain, if our model exhibits the same behavior that we find in how humans do sentences, then maybe that can inform us about that. And I'm focusing on syntax, so that's the sentence structure, and looking at how different sentence structures are more or less difficult to process. But there's also, you could also use this for applications in natural language processing. So for example, in all kinds of different natural language generation systems, you could use this to optimize the user interface. Because if you have a very open text generation system, there are lots of different ways in which you can formulate a certain number of facts. And how do you choose among them? So one possibility would be to use such a function where you put in a sentence at the top, and what you get out is this sentence has this and this difficulty, and on a word-by-word basis, we can say that here there are certain spikes in processing difficulty, for example. And then we could tailor that for different situations. So for example, for a dialogue system, it's been found that if you present the user with really complex sentences or like difficult decisions, they perform worse driving, they do driving errors, and also they like the dialogue system less. So, depending on the situation, when they have other stuff to do, we might want to change that function, just say, okay, now we're going to generate really easy stuff. And then the obvious question is, of course, how do we know what's difficult in the first place? And the way that I'm finding out about this is using eye-tracking. And the idea there is that processing difficulty is essentially proportional to the fixation time. So if somebody looks at a word for a very long time or goes and reads parts of a sentence again, that's probably where they have some difficulty. And if across several subjects everybody has longer reading times on a particular part of the sentence, then that's where we say here's some processing difficulty. So here you can see this person is wearing an eye tracker. Here are two cameras that scan the eyes, and it's calibrated against the screen here. So we know exactly for how many milliseconds this person looked at what letter in the text. Other methods for finding out about processing difficulty would, of course, be like brain imaging, self-paced reading, where people just press spacebar to go to the next word, for example, or just asking them comprehension questions. But I'm not going to talk about these. I'm only going to be focusing on eye tracking. So in my talk, I'm first going to talk about an eye-tracking corpus. And here the focus is on corpus, because that's not what people usually do. In psycholinguistics, people usually do like well-defined experiments with a small set of sentences. But I'm going to use a corpus. I'm going to talk about that. Then secondly, I evaluated different models of processing difficulty on this corpus, on this data source. And thirdly, I will talk about my own sentence processing model, which I'm proposing. So for the eye-tracking corpus, traditionally, people always use this experimental approach here. So in this paradigm, materials are carefully designed to eliminate any kind of potential confounds. So if you want to find out about a special phenomenon, you just keep everything else stable and just provide a millimole pair, have people read that, and then see which one comes out to be more difficult. The advantage is there's established reliability and validity. People have done this for years. But there are some drawbacks, I think. So, for example, the sentences are typically presented out of context or with a very minimal context, just because you can't keep people in the labs for 10 hours just to come across the things that you want them to come across, right? Also, the materials are constructed manually by the experimenter, and sometimes, you read these items and you wonder, like, wow, does that ever occur in real text, or is this even grammatical? So, and the last thing is, we know that humans learn really rapidly, and if you want to test for some really rare phenomenon, then the question is, of course, do people, quickly find a strategy, even during the experiment, to cope with this special phenomenon? So you may be biasing your results by presenting them with these things more than would be normal. In the corpus, everything's in context, of course. There are lots of data points, and we can test the theories on lots of different constructions. But of course, less control, actually no control over the materials. Of course, we can just select the ones that we want, so that gives us some control over what we analyze. And then the last thing is, people haven't done this before, at least not for higher level processing. So it's not an established method to use a corpus here. But I'm going to talk about why I think it's a valid method. So another point is methodologically, an advantage of the corpus is we can just use this one resource and use several theories, all evaluate them on this one corpus resource, and then see how they perform on this data. Also, we can find out how much of the variance in reading times we can explain. And this is interesting because with the experimental paradigm, you usually only compare two conditions, and you see like the one here reading is a bit slower than the other condition, but you don't really know how much of the variance you're explaining. You see there's a significant difference, but how much of the variance among all the variance that's in the data is that? And that's hard to assess in the experimental paradigm. And we can then assess how well these theories that have been produced based on the experimental paradigm scale up to naturally occurring text. Okay, so the Dundee Corpus is the resource that I'm using. It's called Dundee Corpus because it was produced in Dundee in Scotland. It contains 51,000 words of British newspaper articles. That's about like 20 newspaper articles. They're from the independent newspaper, and they were read by 10 different people. And this is what the data looks like that we get. So this is the text from the corpus. The red dots here are the fixation points. So when we read a text, the eyes don't move smoothly, right? They always jump in saccades from one bit to the next. And then the blue numbers here are how many milliseconds the person fixated on this particular letter or spot. And when you look at this, you see that often function words are skipped. So for example, these kind of very frequently occurring words are skipped, whereas content-bearing words are fixated more often. And once we have this data, there are different analyses that we can make. So for example, if this is how the person read the text in time, then we can analyze the first fixation times, which would just be number 5 here, or the gaze duration, which would be like 5 and 6 together, or total reading time. And these give us different stages of the process. So the early measures here would give us more information about like lexical access processes, whereas these ones usually reflect more of the deeper understanding processes. But since we don't have close control over the text, as I said before, there are lots of different aspects that can influence the reading time at a specific word, right? So there's not only the syntax, there's going to be like the word length, the word frequency, and all these have influence on the fixation time on a specific word. And since we don't control for those, we have to somehow account for them and see what of the variance remains to be explained in the first place. So the way we do this is using hierarchical mixed effect models. And they have a dependent variable. This is the target variable that we want to fit. That would be, for example, first fixation duration or gaze duration or total reading times, the ones that I talked about before. Then we have the random variable, sorry. That's the subject, because each person may have a bit some different reading characteristics. So we want to take those, make a separate regression layer for the subjects. And then we have the independent variables. So this is on the one hand our model that we want to test. But on the other hand, it's a bunch of confounding factors. For example, the word length, the word frequency. For example, the part of speech take of the word, or the fixation landing positions, all the different things that we know have influence on reading times. And now, so as a proof of, I said before that there's no established reliability for using a corpus. So what I did as a first step is I took this example relative clauses, and there's a lot of consensus in the research community that object relative clauses are more difficult to process than subject relative clauses. So an object relative clause is something like the reporter who the senator attacked admitted the error, and this here is more difficult to process than the subject relative clause who attacked the senator. Okay, so there's a lot of consensus there, and I said, okay, if we can find that in the relative clauses of this corpus, we find the same pattern, and our regression methods are powerful enough to find this pattern in the data, then that's some evidence. Of course, not a proof, right? But there's some evidence that maybe this corpus is a useful additional resource that we can use to find our results. So this graph here is not from my data. This is from the literature, and this is self-paced reading times. The curve above here is for object relative clauses, and simply this says, okay, the reading times are longer if it's an object relative clause on this part of the sentence here, respectively. So for the relative clause analysis, here the relative clause again, I used the Dundee Corpus and parsed it with the Charniak parser so that we know what the sentence structure in the corpus are. Then I automatically extracted the relative clauses from the Dundee Corpus. And I found that there were 434 relative clauses. 14% of them were object relative clauses, and most of them are subject relative clauses, but that's what you would expect. Subject relative clauses are more frequent, so that's fine. And then I did 3 experiments on the different regions. So, for example, comparing the reading times on the relative pronoun in the 2 different sentence types, comparing the reading times on the verbs in the sentences. And I'm not going to talk in detail about those experiments. I'm just going to use one of the experiments as an example. So this is for the reading times on the main verb. So that's comparing reading times on a verb like this in the subject relative clause to reading times at this verb here. And as I said, the literature says that reading times should be longer here. So this is the result from running the model, and I'm going to talk you through this. So what we have here, the intercept, would be the base reading time, so to say. So everything else being equal, you would expect that the word would have a reading time of 263 milliseconds. I mean, this is for verbs in these relative clauses. then if it is a relative clause type, in order to predict a good reading time, we would have to subtract 177 milliseconds from those. For each character in the word, so in the verb, we would add another 20 milliseconds. Then for the log frequency value, for each unit of those, you would subtract another 11 milliseconds. So this essentially means longer words is longer reading times. There it is. More frequent words is shorter reading times. And this is the patterns that you would expect. And the important thing to take away from this slide is that the subject, in the subject's clause condition, the reading times were shorter. So that's what the regression model predicts. And this means the verbs are read faster in the subject relative clause condition. So that's some evidence that the corpus does actually give us the same patterns that we expect. Then I implemented two previous theories of sentence processing difficulty and evaluated them on this corpus. There's a bunch of work that's been done before in this area, and I picked two of the methods, surprisal and dependency locality theory. And the reason I picked these two are that they are kind of complementary, I think. So they cover different aspects. So I'm going to explain them in more detail in the next slides. In surprisal, you can think of it as a forward-looking measure. So the comprehension difficulty at a word is essentially proportional to the amount of surprisal or surprise when hearing that word. And the idea there is that, if you hear the beginning of a sentence and have a good expectation of what the next word is going to be, you're not surprised. That's really easy. That's what you were expecting anyway. But if there's something that's really surprising, a surprising structure, a surprising word, then that's going to be difficult. And in a more mathematical sense, surprises the word's negative log probability in context. The underlying assumptions of this theory are that comprehension is incremental. So when you get new word input, you update your representation of what's happening in the sentence. And generate these expectations about what's going to come up in the sentence. Right, that's when it is said. But there's a bunch of open questions here, of course. So, for example, what would be a good, if you want to implement this, then you have to ask yourself, what would be a good grain size for those word probabilities? Do we only want to look at the structural probabilities or also at the lexicalized probability? So what's the grain size of the prediction that's going on in our heads, so to say, right, if we take this as a serious approach? Or other features might be important, for example, animacy and so on, that have influence on our probability models in our heads. So for here, this is, so in order to determine the surprisal at a specific word, we have to calculate the prefix probability at each word. So for example, if we're hearing the reporter, then there's a bunch of different representations that the reporter could be like just the subject of a sentence, or like it could be modified later. There are all these different possible structures. And the prefix probability of the reporter, the string the reporter, would be the sum of all those different probabilities of the trees. And then surprisal would be that, the next word, for example, you get something that's compatible only with this structure. Then you have to get rid of the probability of this structure, and the surprise is just the difference at each word. How much of the probability structure do you have to forget, so to say? So the idea is if, the word that you hear is only compatible with a structure that's very, very low probability, then that's really difficult. So here's when we let this implementation run on a sentence that we saw before in the relative clause, for example, then here we say, okay, this is just for this is non-lexicalized, right? So once we've heard, we're not surprised to see that a sentence starts with a determiner. Then once we've seen a determiner, we're not surprised that there's a noun following. But we're fairly surprised that there's a relative pronoun coming after the noun, because that doesn't happen all of the time, right? Then once we have seen the relative pronoun, we're not surprised to see a verb, but relatively more surprised to see a determiner and so on. I mean, you get the idea. So when I ran this on all the sentences of the Dundee Corpus, I found that there was a positive coefficient here, and that means that this predictor, so the surprisal at each word in the sentence, is a significant positive predictor of reading time in the corpus. So that would be support for this kind of theory. I also did this with lexicalized surprisal and just simple n-grams. But actually, lexicalized surprisal was not significant over just using a simpler measure such as simple n-gram probabilities as an estimator. But structured surprisal was good over and above the other predictors. The second theory, which I want to talk about, is dependency locality theory. And this one is quite different from surprisal in that it's a backward-looking measure. So this captures, given what you've heard so far, how difficult is it to integrate that with what you're hearing now. So if you have a long-distance dependency or really deep center embedding, that's difficult, according to this theory. So integration cost occurs at the heads of phrases when the dependents are integrated. So for example, the verb is the head of the phrase here. The verb has the dependents who and the senator. And when we get to the verb here in the subject relative clause condition, we only have to integrate this thing here. It's really close, so it's quite easy to integrate. But in this object relative clause case, we have two things that we need to integrate, two dependents. And this one here is a bit further away, so this adds up to more difficulty. So the theory would predict that this should be more difficult in the object relative clause condition. So I implemented this on top of the minipar dependency parser, so that I would get the difficulty predictions for each word in the corpus according to this theory. And what I found was actually very unfortunate, I thought, at first glance, because I found that the integration cost was a negative predictor. So that would mean more integration cost makes it easier or faster to read the sentence. This is really not what we want, right? Because this shouldn't happen according to the theory at all. And the theory had been shown before to be valid, and lots of different experimental data found this is actually what people find. So I was really surprised to see this, and even significantly negative. So I looked at the data in a little bit more detail, and thought, okay, a possible explanation is actually the sentences that we're looking at are quite different from the sentences that people usually use in their experiments. They have all kinds of, other words in them, not just like subject, verb, object sentences. So maybe there's a lot of words that we just don't see any integration cost for because the theory doesn't cover predicting anything for those words. And actually, so this plot here shows the predicted reading time on the residuals, so all the other factors taken out. Given the integration cost, what would you predict as a reading time? And here, actually, we see a positive slope. It is relatively noisy, especially for words with very high integration costs, just because there are very few data points. But the important point here is that this one at 0 is relatively high, right? Especially since these ones are quite sparse, it's higher than all of those ones. So this may drive the effect that we see with a negative coefficient there. So I thought, okay, what if we only look at the nouns and verbs, which are the words that the theory actually does do predictions for? So for nouns, everything was fine. We get a positive coefficient, so that means when a noun has a positive integration cost, like a higher integration cost, then that's longer reading times. That's a good thing, supporting the theory. But for verbs, I didn't find that. I didn't find a significant prediction for verbs, and actually verbs are, the main thing that this theory does predictions for, right? Verbs are most often the heads of sentences, so there should be, it's really disturbing if this doesn't come out, right? But I found that auxiliaries seem to facilitate processing at the verb. And yeah, so one factor that contributes to what the predictions of this theory are also the underlying syntactic formalism. So what are the dependencies between the words? This is only built on top of that. So if you used another syntactic theory, so for example, HPSG or so, the predictions may differ. So it's really important to also choose a syntactic theory that captures, or that tries to model the processing, psycholinguistic processing. So, but I want to conclude for DLT for the moment. So the findings were that DLT predicts zero integration for most of the corpus. So this theory, which has been developed based on the experimental data, only really didn't provide a lot of coverage for real problems for using this on a corpus. Did make the correct predictions for nouns, but not for verbs. And there's maybe some stuff that we want to look at in more detail. So the summary for the broad coverage analysis are that this backward-looking theory had some positive but mixed results, and surprisingly did work for the structural integration. And the question that comes up here is, since they seem to be capturing really different parts of processing, can they be combined maybe, or can they be improved? Can we generate a syntactic processing theory that takes advantage of what we've learned so far? So in the last part of my talk, I want to talk about the syntactic processing model that I'm proposing. Sorry. So the requirements for building a syntactic processing model are, of course, that should be cognitively plausible. It should have cross-linguistic validity. We don't want to assume that German brains work differently from American brains or so, just because they were raised with a different language. Then we want to be broad coverage, so we want the theory to cover all the different words and actually make predictions. And of course, we want to account for a large body of empirical findings from the literature, which come from those experimental paradigm. So the assumptions in my model are incrementality. So incrementality of processing means that on a word-by-word basis, when you perceive a word, you build your representation, you update your idea of what's going on in the sentence. And here, I say in the strict sense, because I'm assuming full connectivity at each point. So that means that you don't defer any processing till later. You try to be really eager in building up your representation of what's going on in the sentence. Sorry, let's first talk about this. Recently, it's been found that people do seem to do prediction when they hear a word. So, when I talk to you, if I just stopped in the middle of the sentence, maybe you would be able to fill in the word that I was maybe not being able to remember at that moment. And also, I'm going to assume parallel processing. So you could either say, OK, all the processing in the brain is done serially. You know, one by one, we go through different analyses. And then when we find the right one, we're like, hey, I understood what you said. Or that's could be all parallel. And yeah, the other thing that I want to do is, you know, combine this forward and backward ideas that I talked about before. Unfortunately, all of these assumptions are kind of controversial among psycholinguists. So as an anecdote, so for example, my first supervisor actually assumes all of those or believes all of those. My second supervisor doesn't believe any of those. But it's good to always have some controversy, I guess. So the important point I want to make here is that the interesting thing, you know, the primary motivation about why one wants to build a model is that we can really follow through and see what the implications are of saying, OK, human processing is incremental. What does that imply if we say that? And then can we maybe, from those questions, generate, you know, conduct more experiments or find more evidence whether we can support this claim? So the basic concepts of the model that I'm proposing is that at each stage, we have a set of expectations about what we still need in order to achieve a grammatical sentence. So once you've only heard like the determiner the, you may want to say, OK, you know, I still need some noun, I still need some verb. You have these expectations. And all the expectations are stored in the brain or kept track of in the brain in parallel. And they're stored in memory. So of course, memory is not infinite, right? So at least not at any given point in time. So you can only keep track of so many analyses at the same time. And there's some decay. So sometimes, you know, you've certainly experienced that yourself. You start your sentence, you know, go on your sentence, and by the end of the sentence, you've forgotten actually how you started your sentence, right? So decay should capture that effect. And then there's also a verification component, which plays with the kind of prediction or expectations that you build up. And that actually links this kind of framework to processing difficulty. So if, you know, I had an expectation about what was going to come up in the sentence, and I find it, then that's going to be really easy if it was something I was strongly expecting. That's what this says. And if it wasn't too old. And if you know, I had a very strong expectation for something to come up, but that didn't come up, I have to forget this analysis that I was building up so far. And that was a really high probability analysis, then that's going to be very difficult as well. So this is just the formula that formalizes this model. So in order to build such a model, I have to define the linking theory. This is essentially what I was just talking about on the last slide. Then I have to build a parser that satisfies the constraints that I gave in the beginning. So it has to be an incremental parser in order to give us the right information in order to generate the expectations, for example. And it has to be probabilistic, because I want to keep track of everything in parallel and now the probabilities of my expectations and analyses. And I also have to choose a grammar formalism that, you know, I want to build this parser on top of. I'm not going to go into much detail here. You can ask me about that later. But I chose tree adjoining grammars because I thought they would let me best implement this strong notion of incrementality. So what are tree adjoining grammars? I don't know if you're familiar with them. Essentially, how they work is that a lexicon entry is represented by an elementary tree. So for example, Peter would be represented by being an NP. A verb like sleeps would be represented by being the head of a sentence and needing a noun phrase in order to build a sentence. And there are two elementary functions in tree adjoining grammar. One is substitution. That means when something is requiring a noun phrase, like here, that's noted with a little arrow here, and then something else can satisfy that requirement, then we can join them together, and they can build a tree, like this tree here. And the other one is used for recursive structures. So for example here, deeply, from the lexicon, we know that deeply would be an adverb that needs a verb phrase to join into, so it needs to modify a verb. And this would just find an accessible node of the same type and expand it. So like these two go into here and build a new branch there. So as I mentioned before, it's really crucial to my theory that we can generate these predictions or expectations at every point in the sentence. They're really important to calculate what we are still expecting in order to build a grammatical sentence. So for example, and here I want to talk about how we can generate those expectations, so what these expectations are generated by in this theory. So for example, if we've seen the horse seldom so far, there's no way that we can connect the horse and this seldom tree together, right? They don't have any open slots. They don't have any matching categories. So if we don't add any additional functionality here, then we can't join them together, right? So here, we would have to just keep them around until we see the head of this phrase, but then we wouldn't be fully connected, right? We wouldn't be incremental in the strongest sense because we haven't figured out what the relation between those two is. So in order to make this fully incremental, we need to also have those connecting structures. And at this point, we would be predicting that there has to be a verb phrase later, once we've seen this, even though we haven't seen the verb yet. Another way of generating predictions is through the lexicon entries, because this verb here knows that it's going to need two noun phrases in order to build a sentence. So if we always connect our structures as far as possible, we always can just read off the graph what we need in order to build a grammatical sentence. So that's going to be our expectations. And once we have those expectations, so here, for example, we're expecting the verb phrase, and we haven't actually seen anything that's the head of a sentence yet. So we predicted those nodes, denoted by the blue arrows here. And then once we see what we were predicting, we have to unify those two structures, right? We always have to make sure that everything we predicted, we actually do see later on. Otherwise, we would just overgenerate and generate incorrect representations. So here's the relative clause again. I hope you're not tired of relative clauses yet. So this is an example for an object relative clause here. So if we had like my grandparents who, and we would interpret this as an object relative clause, so who my father said whatever, or my father talked to, for example, right? It was this kind of structure. So we would have these two parallel structures to keep track of. And they have different probabilities. Subject relative clauses occur more frequently than object relative clauses, for example. So we say, okay, this one has a certain probability, this one has a certain probability. Next word we see is time. time also has different structures. It could, it could be a verb, could be noun, and depending on what it is, it would bring a different lexicon entry with it. So now, in order to predict how difficult it is to have time at this point, we'd have to consider, okay, can we connect this structure with anything in these? And in fact, we can, because this can go into here. So we could say my grandparents, who time has made whatever, or riddled in the face, or so we could connect this, or we could see like, oh, this one, how does this connect with any of these structures? And in fact, we can join it with this structure down here. Match it up, everything fits nicely. The predictions are satisfied. And so, these probabilities are, of course, made up. So once we have the incremental parser, we can just determine them on the fly and calculate what our prediction is at each point in the sentence, how difficult, what the probabilities of the structures are. And then if we would get, after time, if we would get a new verb, then we would know, okay, it can't have been this structure because this one doesn't have any space to put a verb in it anymore. And then we would know that, okay, this structure we have to get rid of, so that's causing processing difficulty. So then the question is, how can I generate all those lexicon entries automatically from a tree bank? And one way to do that is to, so this would be the annotation in the Penn tree bank, for example. And the first thing is we have to figure out what is the lexicon entry from the corpus. So other people have done that, and have transformed the Penn tree bank into tag format, so that's not a problem. And the second thing we need to figure out what the connection path is. So that's essentially how much of the structure do we need to fully connect all the lexical entries that we've seen so far. And so at every point where there's some color in the little loop here that we haven't seen a lexicon entry for yet. So for example, here for green, we have within this, at the point we've only seen the in Italian, we haven't seen people. So this is something that we need to predict first. So we can automatically generate the necessary prediction entries for our lexicon from this structure. Okay, so I'm getting to the end of my talk. So the task for implementing this model is firstly transform the Penn tree bank into this format, which I just showed, then extracting the lexicon. And this is like how far along I am so far in my PhD. The next step will be to train a statistical incremental parser for this theory. There are a number of other incremental parsers around. They work on other grammar formalisms or other versions of the grammar formalism, but essentially it's a well-known problem. And then I have to define a probability model for my particular tree adjoining grammar theory. And lastly, once I get all the predictions on a word-by-word basis, according to this theory, I'll be able to evaluate it on the Eyetracking corpus again and compare it to the other theories that I've evaluated before. So in summary, on the high level, my talk's been about how does syntax influence processing difficulty, and how can you model this processing difficulty. In summary, first I've talked about the the Eyetracking corpus that I'm using as a resource. I've shown that there's some evidence that it's a valid resource that gives us complementary evidence that, in addition to experimental studies. Also, I've evaluated two previous theories of processing difficulty, and lastly, I've proposed my own theory, which tries to combine different aspects from the previous theories and model prediction and strong incrementality in order to see what the implications of those assumptions are. Okay, thanks for your attention. And yeah, feel free to ask me some questions.
I'll ask one. I'll use the microphone, I guess.
Okay.
So you talk a lot about measuring difficulty of written sentences and reading, but probably mostly this would be used for spoken sentences, right? I mean, when the person is driving or in some other way engaged and the computer is talking to them, I assume that would relate, but can you talk about the difference between those two?
Right. That's a very valid point. They may not, the sentence structures are, of course, going to be the same, but maybe we're measuring something different when we look at people's reading behavior. That's a very valid point. One reason why we look at reading is when people are just listening, it's really hard to know what's going on in their brains. So it's more difficult to have a correlator for that. So one thing that people do is, for example, visual word paradigms. So they have people listen to a sentence and look at the picture. The picture may have like different objects in it. And there's findings that, for example, like one finding for prediction, for example, would be that the person sitting there looking at a picture with a cabbage and a rabbit and a fox and something else, maybe a tree. And the sentence is, it's a German experiment, but so the sentence essentially says like, the fox eats, the fox and then eat, but in German it can be that the fox is the fox eats, and then people anticipate that it's going to be the rabbit and not the cabbage, for example. Or the more interesting case, of course, when you say the rabbit eat or is eaten, and then depending on which one it was, eat or is eaten, it'll be the fox or the cabbage. And the idea is that if people, integrate the fox and the eat correctly, given the syntactic structures, they're either, going to look at the cabbage or at the fox, depending on which one it is. So you can do some things with those visual word paradigms. And another thing is people are looking at how big the pupil is. So apparently, but that's kind of a new thing, I guess. If something is really difficult, like you're concentrating very hard, thinking very hard about something, apparently the pupil is open a bit wider. So they try to measure how far open that is. But it's, I don't know how noisy that is, and I haven't done anything with that myself. Okay.
Something I missed early on. Could you say again what is lexical surprisal as opposed to structural surprisal?
Oh, yeah. The question was what's lexical surprisal as opposed to structural surprisal. So let's see where. Sorry. I wanted to show it with a picture. So here the probabilities would be from these kinds of rules for structural surprisal. What's the probability that an S has a noun phrase and verb phrase, and so on. And for lexicalized surprisal, you would add some more rules that says, like, how probable is it that the is a determiner? How probable is it that the reporter, like, given that we have a noun, how probable is it that it's going to be the reporter? So, for very frequent words, you get high probability numbers there. But if you have something that's a really weird word you haven't heard before or once in your life, that's going to make the sentence also more difficult according to the lexicalized structure. Okay.
All right, so it's 1 o'clock, so we should probably end the talk. But Vera will be here to answer any more questions. And thank you very much, Vera.
Okay, thanks.